What's up, ego hackers? Welcome to the C.S. Joseph podcast. Premium edition for paying members, the journeymen and acolytes both. Welcome to a new seasonal presentation. This is season 14, part 3, also known as True Duality, also known as the Bronze Pairs, also known as the Natural Compatibility Relationship. Out of the one of the 8 sexually compatible relationships for people to choose from. And I know that this particular lecture series has been asked for a very long time. It is season 14, part 3. Remember, part 4 is what we're going over right now, discussing colloquial duality, which is basically the polar opposites, and we're discussing that on YouTube and on the podcast. But for all of you who are tuning in this time, we're going to be talking about compatibility instead of camaraderie, and potentially all of the benefits and potential hiccups of this particular relationship. Just remember that according to socionics, if you have an actual accurate understanding of socionics, socionics actually recommends this kind of relationship, psychologically speaking, right? So from a psychological perspective, this is what it goes for the most, which is pretty awesome. It's pretty awesome to have a lot of support out there for this kind of relationship. Now, most people are just like, okay, yeah, Mr. C.S. Joseph, you were actually originally correct, but no, I wasn't. And thank you all for being supportive of me throughout the community, but the reality of the situation is that's not the case. I was wrong about socionics, and it's really important to me that I take responsibility for my actions. So, all that being said, welcome to the show. It's fantastic that you're all here. So yeah, bronze pairs. Bronze pairs are, quite frankly, utterly fantastic, but I have to admit, I don't really have much experience with the natural relationship, and I think part of the reason, there's actually multiple reasons for that, for me personally. It's just that, like, the bronze pair relationship is, like, at a much higher barrier of entry than people actually realize. While it is the relationship where the advice, quote, be yourself, is the most suited for and probably completely unsuitable advice for any other relationship, it's this relationship where you can actually be yourself. The problem is that from my perspective, especially with my upbringing, especially how things were in my 20s, I was never actually allowed to be myself. And because I was never really allowed to be myself, because myself, as in my ego, was never accepted by anyone, much less my subconscious was never really accepted by anyone, it's extremely difficult, or at least it was extremely difficult during my childhood and during my 20s to even get to a point where I was even able to be myself, which basically means in terms of the natural relationship or the bronze pair, ultimately I was at a severe disadvantage. So as a result, sadly, I do not have as much anecdotal evidence to offer when it comes to this particular relationship due to my lack of personal experience with it. Not to say that I am entirely without experience, but, you know, honestly, like, I've never really had an opportunity to get as close as possible as I can with an ISFP woman, because in any opportunity that I did previously have, there was just some extenuating circumstances that made it impossible to do so. Like, for example, a few ISFPs that I knew, they were married, and I'm not going to be in a relationship with a married woman. I'm just not. Unless, of course, I actually have, spelled out permission by, her husband, for example, which has only happened one time in my life. But for the most part, I'm just not really interested in engaging in those kinds of entanglements because, for example, my personal belief system, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, that is a big deal to me. And there's a few other supporting scriptural perspectives when it comes to that. So it's such a gray area that it's kind of like, yeah, I'm not going to end up taking the risk. And while I enjoy ISFPs and ISFP women heavily, it never really sat right with me that I would be facilitating their hypergamy, and I just really don't want to do that. Men really need to come together and be supportive of men, and that's especially when all of a sudden those men come to realize that their women are being a little bit loose, and it's important that we have our fellow man's back instead of facilitating hypergamy and giving into the whims of the female sexual strategy, even if it benefits us personally. It's not really an ideal situation. And so long as men have each other's back, then it becomes like a cultural norm, right? And that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. Fatherlessness continues to be a problem, and it is the number one problem that basically plagues our society. So, just like the prophecy offered by Malachi in the final 2 verses of the Old Testament, it's really important that we see that through, especially as a community. And it starts by, behaving, from this perspective, or at least acting by example, right? So, and, that's no different with like a bronze pair. I mean, and we'll talk more about my personal experience with the bronze pair, with the natural relationship in the ENTP and ISFP episode coming up very soon. But until then, we're going to leave my anecdotes for much later, because I have a completely different perspective than most people would realize. You can almost consider that episode to be kind of like a part 2, basically, of the season 21 episode that I did for ENTPs.
Oh, yeah.
So that all being said, today's particular episode, we're discussing the first natural relationship, is the ESTJ and the INFJ. And of course, many people are excited because instead of having to wait towards the end of a particular season, all of a sudden, like, INFJ is like the very first episode, and people are like, oh yeah, this is great, and then all of a sudden, like, INFP happens to be the second episode. So episode's gonna get a little bit shaken up. I mean, my episode is definitely the second to last one for sure, so, which is fine. I mean, as much as people think I like talking about myself, I kind of don't, because it's a very humiliating situation, but I try my best to be honest regardless, even about my own flaws, because I'm honest with everyone else about their flaws, so it's only fair, and I'm just trying to keep it fair. It just kind of boggles my mind, much less amazes me, as to how many people within this community, or even the people who don't actually participate in this community, are just not aware of how fair I actually am. And it'd be nice if they could show a little bit of gratitude, for the fact that sometimes I'm much harder on myself and my own type than I am the others. And very few people can kind of understand that. But, when you talk about INFPs or ENFPs who often complain that I'm, attacking them the most or whatever, the thing is that one could argue it hurts them more than it hurts other people, hence their reaction, because of how emotional they are with their high introverted feeling. But who knows? I mean, that's not really for me to judge. I'm not an NFP. And honestly, like, people will compare dicks as much as they compare pain, and that's not what we're trying to do here. So yeah. Bronze pair relationship. So, theoretically speaking, when talking about compatibility, we've always said that the golden pair is the best on paper. And then after a while, I started having doubts about that. And then I actually concluded for a little bit while that the natural relationship was actually the best relationship on paper. But even that, too, is not true. And we're going to be discussing why that is within the context of this lecture today. But the reality of the situation is, out of the 8 sexual compatibilities, while it's very easy to rank them and figure out which one's the best for me, etc., that's still fundamentally a lie. That's still a fundamental lie. That's still not really how it actually works. That's not how life works. The reason why is because, like, when you start to discuss things like octogram or human nurture, you start to see that the 8 sexually compatible relationships are made to meet people exactly where they are at in life, and based on their needs and wants at that particular moment in time in their life, there is a relationship for them, basically. So instead of trying to like swim against the current in life and try to design and have this designer life, basically, like INTJ women do this all the time, INFJ women do as well, INJ women, NT women, NJs, just NJs, NJ women, like NJ women have this perspective of, having a designer lifestyle or a designer life or a designer relationship, and they think that they can rank the relationships, based on best to worst. And while I originally believed that you could do that, I no longer believe that. The reason I don't is because I realize that the 8 sexual compatibilities each have their own use and are necessary for particular situations. However, it is important to note that when it comes to the natural relationship, aka the bronze pair, statistically, this is the relationship most people marry, and it's also the relationship that where they're most likely to stay together. Okay, that's a fact. That's a thing. No, that's not the golden pair. That's not the silver pair. It's not the pedagogue relationship, also known as the companion. Technically, the natural, statistically, is it. And maybe that's evidence that supports that the natural is probably the best relationship anyone could get, potentially. And there are a few people in my inner circle who would definitely argue that. But at the end of the day, each relationship has its benefits. Each relationship has its hang-ups. And, it really comes down to, pick your pleasure, but it also comes down to pick your poison, right? Everyone's life is different. Everyone is in a different place in their life. Everyone is making decisions differently. And it kind of goes back to, the old adage that I'm sure INFPs would appreciate, that where a human being is ultimately capable of anything. Given the right circumstances, a human being could potentially make any decision. They could become a murderer, for example, or a thief, or given the right circumstances. I'd like to say the same thing, that when it comes to relationship selection, that's the same. That's also very true. And this is important because this is one of my biggest problems with the ego hacker community, is that there's not enough critical thinking when it comes to relationships. Because a lot of women, especially women who are in development phase within the ego hacker community, they have utilized my words and twisted my words and utilized my words as justification for them to end their marriages. And ultimately contribute to the fatherlessness. And I don't appreciate that. I'm completely against that, and I'll have nothing to do with that. I mean, that's ultimately bullshit. And I don't feel very confident in that. And I've had that happen many, many times. I've also noticed, within the ego hacker community, women who are in development phase, for example, sometimes they'll even project their desire to be with someone else onto me, and then they'll actually attempt to leave their families for me. I mean, this happens like a major thing like that happens, at least to me, at least once a year. At least. It sometimes happens more than once a year, sometimes twice a year. Not more than twice a year that I've experienced it, but it's I keep telling these people, these women within the community, it's no, that's not how I work. I'd rather them actually take the time to communicate with their husbands about what their actual issues are. But the thing is, when you look at, from the male perspective of money, muscles, and game, these men just don't get it because they've been conditioned to believe, the blue pill agenda, as some people would call it. And, the women know that just because, I say something, they're not going to change. But at the same time, just because I speak the truth, it's not my responsibility. So what's the point? What's the point of saying this? The point is that before you get into a marriage, it's important that everybody understands exactly what the consequences are of getting into a sexual relationship, for example, and then ultimately creating a family as a result. I hope that by me creating this content and this information, that everybody would be properly armed and dangerous just before they end up creating relationships. And then as a result of having these, as a result, they're properly equipped to, handle those relationships such that they don't end their families, such that fatherlessness is not that much of a problem anymore because everyone's been properly educated before they actually decide to, for example, tie the knot. And not very many people have that opportunity. Not very many people can hear the sound of my voice, for example. Not everybody will have the that information. But I hope by educating members of the Ego Hacker community that you folks out there can educate other people to prevent these really bad outcomes. Right now the family is destroyed. The family is ridiculous. But we can put our hope into something. And I personally believe that because of how the statistics are, the statistics show that natural pairs, aka bronze pair, is the most likely that a person will marry, and also the most likely marriage that will stick together. I think that based on this, that the natural relationship probably is the absolute best relationship to have as a foundation for having a family. So if you're like a man and you're looking to have a woman be the mother of your children, I would recommend that you consider your natural pair. I really would. That's not to say golden or silver couldn't do it, but that just really depends on your life and where you're at in your life. Also depends where she is at in her life as well. Very much depends. So just keep these things in mind. Because in the natural relationship, everybody has the opportunity to communicate, because the natural relationship helps them with the idea that the natural relationship represents that safe space where you can actually be yourself, where your ego is basically being fed by the other person and you're feeding their ego. You feel secure enough in your ego to the point where it literally creates secure attachment style, which would give you the opportunity to just be straight up direct with your partner, to the point where you could go up to your partner and just be like, hey, I'm really unhappy with you right now. I want to have more children, but I don't want to have a child with you. And that would be a huge call to action in a natural pair. A huge call to action. To the point where the natural pair, they may get upset, they may get sad, they may react negatively to that, sure. But the thing is that they're statistically likely to rise to the occasion. They'll rise to the occasion. And they will change for the better. They will grow, right? Eventually they will grow. Okay? And they're more likely to make that decision instead of just, clamming up and not having anything else to deal with it, or be unwilling to take responsibility. And that's ultimately the beauty of the natural pair. The natural pair being that you are able to reach self-acceptance, or at least get into the relationship because you already have achieved self-acceptance, but the other person is going to accept you. And not only that, they're especially going to accept you when things are rough, right? They're really going to accept you when things are rough. The golden pair, for example, while the golden pair is kind of actually an easier relationship to get into, the golden pair ends up becoming a far more difficult relationship to maintain. Because in a golden pair, if someone's done their shadow work and actually developed their unconscious and is pretty wise, they don't really have much patience for the other person who is not actually working hard to become wise themselves. While, you yourself, who has already developed your unconscious and you're working on your subconscious, you're trying to get up happiness, and you see the other person just doubling down on trying to be happy at the expense of maturity, but you've had to expense your own happiness for the sake of maturity, it can really cause the relationship to break down. But like I said, the natural relationship is ultimately, psychologically, the relationship at a foundation from which a family can be built. And in my opinion, it is my current opinion, this is an opinion, the opinion is that it's probably the absolute best relationship out of the 8 sexual relationships for a person to create a family with. I think the second best, I don't know, it might be the pedagogue. I'm not really sure, but it might be. But it's super, super situational. I know the golden pair works out pretty well too, but not till after that relationship has suffered a few downs, maybe even a couple of breakups before reconciling. Because usually the golden pair is able to stick together indefinitely post-reconciliation instead of pre-reconciliation, if that makes sense. But the natural, they may get close to ending their relationship, but they have all of that rapport, they have all of that consistent feeding of the ego and enabling that they have for each other. It keeps the relationship steady. It keeps the relationship moving forward. It provides a level of relationship security where it actually develops secure attachment style among the people who participate within a relationship. Whereas, like, for example, the kindred relationship, which is, for example, my relationship with the kindred relationship, while it's a relationship based on kindness, it's the relationship that is ultimately founded upon and sustained by a trauma bond. It's shared trauma. That's what the relationship is all about, shared trauma, right? But that's not what the natural is all about. It's not what the bronze pair is all about. The bronze pair is about something entirely different. And the bronze pair, while it's easier to get into like a golden pair, for example, it is much harder to get into a bronze pair. It really actually is. And this is where a lot of people disagree with me. The problem is, though, is that because of the position of the cognitive functions, the bronze pair has a higher standard for people, for their fellow partner, basically, within the bronze pair. And if that high standard is met, then things get easy from there. But it requires a huge amount of initial investment into one's self and their own personal growth in order to even facilitate the attraction necessary to engage in a natural or bronze pair to begin with. And the ESTJ and the INFJ pair is no different. So I just wanted to give like a general foundation, first 15 minutes or so of this lecture, to give you guys a kind of an idea and some examples as to what some of the actual issues are, right? So with that being said, let's actually now get into the context of the actual relationship itself. So why are the ESTJ and the INFJ ultimately drawn to one another? It's not for the fact that they have great emotional compatibility. It's not for the fact that they have great sexual compatibility. The thing is that when they first meet each other, they don't even actually know that. They really don't. It's not so obvious to them. Like, to a golden pair, it's extremely obvious. It is extremely easy for me to be attracted to an INTJ woman. It's not so easy for me to be attracted to an ISFP woman. But if I end up becoming attracted to an ISFP woman, it's really hard for me to shake that attraction. Just as much as if she finally decides that she wants me, if she finally decides that she's attracted to me, if she finally decides that she has a crush on me, for example, it's really hard for her to let go of it. And she probably won't let go of it, just as much as I wouldn't let go of it. Because once an attachment actually occurs with the natural pair, well, it's there. Golden pair, because it's the highest highs and it's the lowest lows, it's kind of imbalanced. It's kind of like a yo-yo. It can be a lot easier to sever that relationship. And that's why sometimes golden pairs have to suffer breakups. But it's in the act of reconciliation itself that keeps the golden pair going. Whereas in the natural pair, things are so natural, they just don't break up. They usually grow through it. They're usually feeding each other's egos enough to grow through it, because their relationship becomes like this, like you hear the saying, ignorance is bliss, right? The relationship ends up creating enough ignorance to make the relationship blissful enough that they often don't break up in their hard times. And when they're having huge conflict with each other, they actually tend to grow through it. And that's why the relationship is just so powerful. And I highly, highly recommend this relationship, especially if you're planning on building a family. This is the relationship to build a family around. Absolutely. If you want to have a family, this is a relationship that you can, put at this foundation or at the center of this family you're trying to create. and you'll have something exquisite and something amazing, statistically, right? It's not to say that relationships aren't without conflict, but it definitely can happen. So let's go through it. So the natural is one of the greatest relationships available between all the 16 types. There's a unique opportunity for excitement, safety, and healing provided within the barriers of the natural pair. That's also really important. The natural pair, like if you get a compatible octogram, and we haven't really talked about compatible octograms yet, mostly because I'm not ready to discuss it, because right now we're learning a lot about soft locking, and Chris Taylor is moving things forward with his research into soft locking, and I actually was able to share some anecdotes with him recently, talking about various people close to me in my life and how I behave around them, how they behave around me, and identifying soft lock potential. But understanding a person's octogram and how octogram measures their human nurture, you can actually see how that actually directly impacts their relationship potential, how it can make it very difficult but also very easy when it comes to certain relationships when you have compatible octograms. But at the same time, like when you're looking at compatibility between the octogram, just remember that in general, this is me getting general, not specific, but in general, you want a subconscious developed person with an unconscious developed person. As to where their focus is and what side of their mind they're focusing at that moment in time in terms of their development and what they're actively developing, that can change. And it's open to negotiation. And the thing is, what's really great about the natural pair is that it's the most open to negotiation. And with ESTJ and INFJ, there's nothing different. It goes no different. So for those with traumatic upbringings, the natural pair also offers an opportunity to come home and rest within your ego. In the natural, you're often finally safe to be who you are. And that is the number one benefit of the natural pair. The whole old adage of, quote, be yourself. You can be yourself in the natural. In fact, it's the only relationship out of the 8 sexual relationships that you can be yourself. It's the only one. You have to adjust yourself, or you have to perform, or you have to look a certain way, or act a certain way, or have game, etc. That kind of crap. Like what the red pill community would tell you, or whatever. The burden of performance is high when it comes to any other relationship, except for the natural. The natural, you don't even really have to worry about that. It is the actual come-as-you-are relationship, which is nice because it really helps people reach self-acceptance faster, and then because they're able to accept the other person, but because they see the failures of the other person within the natural pair, it makes them realize, like, oh, dang, I thought my failures were bad. And then they have the same point of view about you. It's not that you two would actively talk about these issues, but what it causes is a deep love and respect for the other person because of how you're able to deal with each other's hang-ups and solve those problems. It really is a true exchange. They're really strong where you're weak, and you're weak where and you're strong where they're weak, and it becomes this really nice change. So ultimately, the bronze pair brings stability, security, but also a lot of fun. Because again, you get to come as you are. And that's really, really important, especially like for INFJs, because INFJs, they reject themselves. They have the hardest time reaching a high level of self-acceptance within a relationship constantly, which is funny because guess what? ESTJs do as well because of introverted feeling inferior. They already walk around afraid that they're a bad person, so they are also having a hard time with self-acceptance, right? But if an ESTJ with introverted feeling inferior is able to reach self-acceptance, what gives the FI critic of the INFJ the excuse to not accept themselves? You see what I'm saying? And the extroverted feeling parent all of a sudden comes to realize how the ESTJ is accepting themselves, and then all of a sudden the INFJ becomes encouraged, not discouraged. They become encouraged that they can accept themselves as well, because it's like, oh wow, if an FI inferior is able to do it, my FI critic can do it. I know I can. And then the INFJ is able to mirror the behavior of their ESTJ partner within the natural pair and reach self-acceptance faster, right? Or you look at the other way around. You look at the extroverted sensing inferior, being afraid of failure. And ESTJs already walk around basically considering themselves failures, especially the older they get, because they often feel like they're living life backwards, which sucks. It really sucks for them when they really have that perspective. But they see the ESTJ inferior constantly afraid of failure, but then it aspires and it's able to get through that failure and keep trying, keep practicing, and they can actually watch that ESTJ inferior reach mastery. And this encourages the ESTJ to keep going and realizing that it too can be a top performance. So what ends up happening is that the inferior development of both these types end up becoming how the natural pair ends up being these huge examples to one another. So instead of massaging their inferior functions, they are examples of better inferior functions. They are examples of aspiration to one another, basically. This creates a ton of encouragement. This creates a ton of motivation to improve, but it also leads to acceptance, self-acceptance, ultimately, because then their egos have enough space to actually occupy the relationship itself. They don't have to wear masks. They don't have to put on a show. They don't have to perform. They get to come as they are because the other person has the same struggles, if not bigger struggles. And if they're overcoming those struggles, well, what's your excuse? And they realize that's the case. And then all of a sudden, each person within the pair is able to, come to that conclusion of, well, yeah, I should probably just let go of my ego at this point because I'm not as bad as I thought. And that's one of the greatest gifts of the natural relationship. And the ESTJs and INFJs, the performance anxiety of the INFJ, the moral anxiety of the principles of the ESTJ, the self-critic of criticizing one's own performance, the ESTJ, or criticizing one's own sense of personal self-worth on the part of the INFJ. These things just go away. They just go away entirely. And for the first time in their lives, these two types are actually able to live in harmony with themselves because of the harmony coming from the relationship. It is ultimately a healing experience, which is awesome. So, the theme of the natural pair is ease. It's not intrinsically volatile like the golden pair, which is the affection relationship, or inherently challenging like the pedagogue-companion relationship. It's natural because you can be at ease with who you are while in the relationship. It really, it's what you always imagine a relationship should be like, basically. So, and let's be honest, the golden pair, it expects compatibility. It just expects it. And it expects all of the ducks to be in the row. The thing is, though, is that the natural pair leaves room for error. And it also leaves room for growth. The natural doesn't have the expectation. It wants compatibility. It wants to grow. It wants to grow with you. And it does. It does. And then actually, compatibility and the desire is a reward. Whereas from the golden pair, there's the expectation that everything should already be ironed out. Whereas in the sense of a natural pair or the bronze pair, it just ends up working out on its own. All wounds, all scars can be healed. Whereas in a golden pair, if your wounds and scars aren't healed before you start the relationship, then, you have baggage and you're not good enough anymore. And this is why I constantly see golden pairs failing over and over and over, where bronze pairs or natural pairs end up continuing on the flag of their relationship, which is incredible. So how does the ESTJ and INFJ relationship work? So obviously, emotional compatibility and sexual compatibility both being present within the relationship is key, because this basically means each of the two types are able to feed each other's ego. And the other thing is that their inferior functions and their parent functions, their hero functions and the child functions, just because the position of the functions, it creates some amazing things. So for example, extroverted thinking hero is able to lock into introverted thinking child. And the introverted thinking child of the INFJ type, this child function, like the extroverted thinking hero of the ESTJ, is literally their own personal hero. They're like, oh my god, this person is amazing, and they're just constantly looking up to the other person. But guess what? The ESTJ is also looking up to the INFJ, because it's like, wow, they're so willful. They always know what they want all the time, and any child is just like, oh wow, ah. And like, it ends up like, and we talk about, like cognitive looping. Dave Powers in the Objective Personality System community, the OPS community, talks about, being jumpers, right? Well, jumper relationships are just relationships, or jumpers are people who are cognitive looping, who have underdeveloped parent functions, and where it's just like literally all play and no work, right? And that's where their child function and their hero function are ultimately looping together. So like an INFJ looping would be, I think I want to do this. 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 And the ESTJ is like, you think you want to do that? You think you want to do that? You think you want to do that? And they're like, okay. And they just constantly say yes to each other. They say yes to each other like almost too much. That's like they have a very hard time saying no, because their child function is literally looking at the other person's hero, and they're like going, my hero. And then both people within the pair is like, you're my hero, 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 constantly. But it gets even better than that. Let's look at the inferior function. The parent functions definitely line up with the inferiors, because there's extroverted feeling parent within the INFJ, and guess what? It takes care of the FI inferior of the ESTJ. And at last, there's a parent function, or there's a parent around that actually cares about my inferior. Wow, that's amazing. Someone actually cares, or the ESTJ with their introverted sensing inferior. They actually care about the performance of the extroverted sensing inferior, and they go out of the way to make sure that the extroverted sensing inferior is not set up for failure constantly. So the INFJ is able to guide the principles of the FI inferior to facilitate additional FI growth and FI aspiration within the ESTJ. But it also, at the same time, the introverted sensing parent is protecting the extroverted sensing inferior and protecting it from failure all the time. Who wouldn't want that? What INFJ out there wouldn't want that? What ESTJ out there wouldn't want that? That way the ESTJ doesn't have to be afraid of being a bad person anymore. The INFJ doesn't have performance anxiety anymore within the context of the relationship. And they don't have to be afraid. None of these people are afraid anymore. It takes all the fear. And because there's no fear, there's a consistent amount of security. An endless amount of security within the context of the relationship. To the point where eventually these people actually start to think or believe that they can't really do anything wrong within the context of the relationship itself, because the natural pair is just so understanding, and it's such a protection for both of their egos. A bastion for their egos. A bastion that they've never experienced before. The reason why they haven't experienced it before is because it's really hard to actually get into a bronze pair relationship, and we'll discuss that in a minute. So anyway, as a result, like, these two types just energize each other. They energize each other, they protect each other, they help each other fundamentally in every single way. They also help each other reach each other's cognitive origins. The ESTJ is looking for power and authority, and the INFJ is giving them power and authority consistently. The INFJ is looking for intimacy and connectedness, and the ESTJ is consistently bringing them intimacy and connectedness over and over and over. Because, my hero, right? It's literally how it works. So within the natural, each type's hero function is pumped up by the other's child function. The comparison would be like a father in a family who loves to work on vehicles. One day he realizes his son has taken an interest in the mechanics of their car. The father is delighted and wants nothing more to show his son everything he knows. The son, equally delighted, develops a sense of awe for his father, who effortlessly fixes and improves every vehicle he works on. Together, there is an endless source of inspiration that both the father and the son draw from. The hero and child interaction is like having a childhood hero that you idolize or look up to, or someone whose character and behavior sets the standard for your own behavior, basically. That's ultimately what this relationship is all about. A compatible hero child creates this loop of inspiration and engagement. The theme of connection between the hero and the child is basically awe-inspiring. The connection between the parent and the inferior, however, is nurture. The child is in awe of the hero, and the inferior is nurtured by the parent. The cognitive origins of both types can be naturally met through perception and judgment functions alike, which is what we've just discussed. So let's look at optimistic functions. Okay, so the optimistic functions, which was TE hero and TI child, which is ultimately the loop of authority, the cognitive loop of authority, basically, where the TI child is empowering the TE hero to get the power and authority, ultimately the cognitive origin of the ESTJ ego, basically, right? And conversely, it's the same thing for the INFJ from that perspective. And that too, I mean, it's miraculous, folks. It really is miraculous. But let's look at the authority. The INFJ seeks out the ESTJ and allows the ESTJ's authority to speak into their life. TE hero considers the TI child and actively seeks out the INFJ's thoughts. The INFJ is awed at the ESTJ's command of rationality, and the ESTJ is endeared to the innocent and often insightful perspective of the TI child. Not just that, but also that the TI child just doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. It's not absent. Just like, the TI nemesis of the ESTJ is often absent because it's just like, oh, do I have to do all the thinking around here? And then it's like the ESTJ ego gets rest because it's like, oh, thank God, I don't have to do all the thinking around here. And this person's willing to think about everything for me, and I could just outsource thinking to them all day long. Oh, thank God. And they're optimistic about it. Oh, thank God, it's not a chore. And the TE hero is like, oh, this kid gets it. It's not a chore. Yeah, I like hanging out with the kid. I'll be the kid's hero. It's all good. No problem. But there's something similar going on, from, the NI hero to the expert intuition child, which ultimately is the intimacy loop. Same intimacy loop for the INFJ. To feel a high level of connectedness. This happens, basically, the ESTJ ends up providing options and maintaining desirability to their INFJ lover. The INFJ's NI hero gets to run free and lead the relationship with their desire, vision, and will. The INFJ is endeared by NE child's innocent openness, and the INFJ is able to pull the ESTJ ever closer to them. So, this basically ends up happening because the INFJ ends up being given unrestricted freedom to a point because the ESTJ is affiliative. They are all about doing the right thing in the same way that the INFJ is as well. But then while it's in this affiliative perspective, the extroverted intuition child is constantly giving affiliative, filtered, pre-filtered affiliative options and choices to the INFJ, which then allows the INFJ to not have any fear of failure either. Because it's like, wow, any child is constantly giving me options. It's endless options. And I don't have to spend all this time thinking about what I want to do because this person who is affiliative is making these suggestions to me. And it's like, OMG, wow, this is actually pretty great. This is actually pretty fun. And then furthermore, I, as the INFJ, while I'm being given options, if there's something that I want to do and there wasn't an option presented, well, guess what? I'm going to state what I want, and the NE child is just going to go along with it anyway. They're just going to go along with my decision. And they feel comfortable enough to just arbitrarily go with my decision, and they're still going to stick around. They're still going to support me anyway? What? That's a thing? That's the power of this relationship, folks. Let's look at the pessimistic functions. The parent function is never failing its role to when it parents the compatible infant in another person, right? Extroverted feeling parent in the INFJ is made for FI inferior, and introverted sensing parent is made for the extroverted sensing inferior. Extroverted feeling parent and FI inferior, which is basically for how they can provide intimacy. This is the other intimacy loop from a decision-making perspective, from a pessimistic function perspective. Extroverted feeling parent nurtures the FI inferior, becoming sensitive to the ESTJ's own sensitivity. Extroverted feeling parent helps the ESTJ express how they feel and what they value. So most ESTJs out there oftentimes don't even get enough space from people to express what they value or their principles or even how they feel. And that too is a huge problem for them. They can't even really get anywhere in life from that perspective, especially when it comes to people they've grown up with, their families, because everyone's like, well, they're not giving them the room to change. They're not giving them a second chance. And oftentimes they're around people who question whether or not they're even have a soul or whether or not they're even a good person to begin with. But the extroverted feeling parent, the INFJ, facilitates all that for them. So everything that they've ever lost in their childhood in terms of, people accepting them or people actually just, thinking that the ESTJ is actually a principled, moral, philosophical person, while that was not present previously, all of a sudden, within the context of this relationship, psychologically, it is present. Which means they don't have to walk around being so afraid of being a bad person anymore. Because they're already able to reach that high level of self-acceptance anyway, as a result of being in this relationship. That's the entire point. Okay? So, it's a big deal. So, if you parent to introverted feeling inferior is another way the INFJ finds intimacy. They can teach the ESTJ authority by helping to develop the ESTJ's moral philosophy. Also, to filter out, their opinions. Which opinion is good, which opinion is bad. Sometimes ESTJs like to say things and see what sticks on the wall. And the INFJ is like, well, let's criticize that, let's filter it out, let's cut it down to size, let's see if it actually works. And the ESTJ is like, oh, nope, that doesn't work, let's move around. The INFJ is willing to listen to the ESTJ such that the ESTJ is always comfortable in being able to state exactly what it's looking for, what it actually wants. That way the ESTJ is always comfortable in sharing its opinions, whereas it wasn't really necessarily able to. And while an ESTJ is very opinionated and sometimes will just state their opinion regardless, they know at the end of the day the INFJ cares enough to actually be patient enough to think about every single possible angle with it to test their opinions. They're like the ultimate opinion tester. And this way, the ESTJ is constantly in a position of knowing that their principles and their morals and their philosophy is tested, which means it is ultimately reliable, whereas it wasn't reliable previously, which is a big deal. So, the INFJ also expands, at times, selfish and limited view that the FI inferior may have. FI inferior, for example, rarely understands the social consequences of expressing their values and opinions, and often discounts other people's feelings. The INFJ shields ESTJs from this, and ends up actually causing other people to think more highly, to regard, and to respect the ESTJ. Their INFJs are respect generators for their ESTJ lovers. Fantastic, right? Well, let's look like introverted sensing parent's relationship with extroverted sensing inferior, which is the authority loop for these pessimistic functions. Extroverted sensing parent is the rock that the extroverted sensing inferior can fall upon. The ESTJ sees the INFJ's extreme attentiveness to other people's experiences. A responsible introverted sensing parent rewards the effort of the INFJ, but still provides gentle but clear feedback on how their extroverted sensing inferior can improve. The INFJ no longer has to fear rejection or failure. Introverted sensing parent also holds itself to a high standard for consistency and strength. The extroverted sensing inferior can latch on to the introverted sensing and mirror it. This is also how the ESTJ meets their authority origin through their perception functions. They become the standard the INFJ bases themselves and their performance on. It's like, hey, the INFJ, just like the ESTJ gets to test their opinions and their morals, their philosophy on the INFJ, guess what? The ESTJ becomes a testing ground for which the INFJ can test their performance. And if the ESTJ is reacting well and providing honest feedback based on the INFJ's performance, the INFJ just has to practice on the ESTJ and ends up performing better in every other area of their life because they have that consistent feedback from their ESTJ lover to begin with. You see what I'm saying? They don't have to be afraid of failure anymore. They don't have to have performance anxiety anymore. And that's awesome. They're able to aspire and further develop their inferior function as a result. they're able to reach the highest levels of performance in their life as a result of the natural pair. Unbelievable. Actually, it is very believable. So introverted sensing also holds itself to a high standard for consistency and strength. The extroverted sensing inferior can latch onto the introverted sensing and mirror it. This is also how the ESTJ meets their authority engine through the perception functions. So remember, feelings of powerlessness. The ESTJ would end up feeling powerless if they weren't even able to provide their reactions in an honest manner to somebody else who is performing to them. And because of that performance, they're actually able to realize, they're actually even able to gain more power and authority in their lives, because it's like, hey, I'm able to adjust myself and adapt over time based on my behavior. So I can understand what I should be investing my own effort into, right? The INFJ helps guide the introverted sensing parent, because eventually, as they aspire to the extroverted sensing inferior, introverted sensing parent ends up becoming more responsible over time. And it also lends to parent development. The same thing goes with extroverted feeling parent. Introverted feeling inferior has this thing where it's like, hey, as I grow my philosophy, so also does the responsible nature of your parent function. Your FE parent is growing too. Who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't want that? So, as great as this relationship sounds, it's not without its hang-ups. So where the natural pair of this relationship goes wrong. The biggest risk for every single natural pair is ultimately enabling, or being enabling. What is enablement? Enablement is defined as the action of giving someone the authority or means to do something. Though it is a neutral term, enablement carries an implication of unhealthy behavior. In the context of relationships, enablement means not standing in the way of another person's irresponsibility, toxicity, or pride. Enablement is normalizing destructive or irresponsible behavior. For the natural pair, enablement occurs when the hero and child of the two types loops on end. For the ESTJ and the INFJ specifically, this manifests through total unproductivity. Oh my God. When they just become super slothful and just spend all their time chilling and smoking weed and doing nothing. It's crazy. It's like the extroverted sensing inferior is like, oh, I have all this performance anxiety, so I'm not going to perform. And then the ESTJ is like, well, if you're not performing, I ain't doing anything, and then I'm just going to be slothful in response. And then they end up looping on that, and it just creates this downward spiral where one's slothful and the other one is not performing. And they end up both basically amounting to nothing. They don't challenge each other, and they're so unaware of the lack of challenge that they end up just, it's like you see those people that are on the side of the road, this woman and this man just sitting there, and they're basically homeless, and all they're doing is smoking out on the side of the road while also begging for money. Yeah, it's likely they have a natural pair. Seriously, because the enabling is just so terrible. The other problem is that the enabling can become so bad that their parent function's underdeveloped. And as a result, personal responsibility, much less a relationship responsibility, can be completely overlooked within this relationship. This relationship has the potential to be so enabling and so ego-feeding that these two end up going nowhere in life. There is a huge risk of that. And the thing is that they become ignorant to the fact that they're going nowhere. And they're so ignorant, they don't even know how to criticize the other person, because ignorance is bliss. And oftentimes, they often feel like it's their own fault that they're going nowhere, or it's the other person's fault that they're going nowhere. But they don't know what to say or how to broach the situation. They don't know how to use the, hey, anything goes attitude, or the, come as you are attitude, or, utilize the security of the relationship to challenge the other person. Oftentimes, in this relationship, where there actually needs to be fights, where it needs to have conflict, it's avoided entirely, and they end up not having conflict, which is really sad. So this ends up inhibiting their personal growth entirely. That sucks. So let's examine as to why that is. So for the natural, enablement occurs when the hero and child of the two types loops on end endlessly without the parent function to interfere. For the ESTJ and INFJ specifically, this manifests through total unproductivity. The anti-hero, any-child loop gets lost in possibility in imagining futures for themselves that is neither committed to making them true. And the extroverted thinking hero in the TI child loop gets lost in trivial intellectual explorations. When these loops singularly drive the relationship, little gets done. Enablement for these types leads to stagnation, joint isolation, isolating themselves from the world, and degradation. These loops also bring out both types' vices. For example, ESTJ chaos and INFJ corruption, and especially their deadly sins, which is sloth versus lust. What causes enablement? Enablement occurs when there is zero pressure to perform in the relationship. This is due to a lack of maturity and responsibility. Enablement arises from the parent's absence, like parent functions being absent for the relationship. There's another point there as well. Like, there's zero pressure to perform, within the relationship, but also at the same time, like, there's zero pressure to improve, because both of them, when they got into the relationship initially, they believe that they've already arrived. Remember what I was telling you folks earlier about how natural pairs are actually the hardest relationship to actually get into? The reason for that is because when it comes to the inferior function, in order for a natural pair to actually begin, a person has to have already some inferior function development going on. Doesn't matter if it's developed by cognitive axis or if it's developed by cognitive orbit. And usually, like, for example, UDUF types like myself for octagram, we take the longest to develop our inferior function. It's extremely long because we have to develop it via cognitive orbit through the demon function, which means as we develop our demon function, only then does our inferior function develop, which is a huge problem. Versus like most people who are able to develop their inferior function by further moving their hero forward and developing their hero. But if their whole life they've been rejected, their ego's been rejected, which means their hero function has been rejected, their inferior function can't really be developed, or at least they don't even know how to develop their inferior function because their hero function has been so rejected and is so behind in its own growth on its own. So that's why they end up striking a deal with the devil and going to the demon function, and via cognitive orbit, then the inferior function starts developing, which is a very backwards way of doing it, and it takes forever, and it requires the most effort and pain to do so, but it'll still happen. But the point is that both people within a natural pair, before the relationship even begins, have to have an attitude when they're looking at each other, and it's like, hey, this person is going to be great with or without me. They have to have confidence in the other person's ability to make it in life with or without them, which means and if they both have that confidence in the other person to do so, oftentimes they already enter the relationship believing that the other person has already arrived, because just by virtue that they're attracted to the other person, because they're only able to be attracted to the other person because the other person has some development of their inferior, some aspirational growth built up by their inferior function already. And in order for the bronze pair or the natural pair to even exist to begin with, that development has to already pre-exist on both sides. The thing is, though, is that each person within the natural pair is looking at the other person. They're not really looking at themselves. And the only way they really understand or know that they themselves have actually gotten anywhere with their own aspirational development within their inferior functions is because the other person sees it in them, and that's how the natural pair can actually exist to begin with. But without that, it won't even happen. The problem is that due to people's natural lack of self-awareness, they automatically assume that they have arrived just because the other person has easily accepted them. And then that can lead to stagnation and a lack of growth of their inferior function, because it just seems that the other person is already content with their level of aspiration. And that contentment can potentially lead to a lack of growth, which is a problem. So, the biggest challenge in the natural pair is to fend off the ease of the relationship by maintaining personal responsibility. In order to get into the relationship, each person had to have a high level of personal growth. But in order to maintain the relationship, so it doesn't stagnate and this enablement doesn't destroy their lives, they have to have an air of personal responsibility, and they have to develop personal responsibility. It's not enough to have personal growth achieved through inferior function development and aspiration. It's not enough. They still have to have the personal responsibility, which comes as a result of developing their parent function. And this is why it's the biggest challenge of the natural pair. As great as the natural pair is, a person being irresponsible can ultimately destroy their life, destroy the life of their partner, as well as destroy the life of their children. And it could threaten everybody. I mean, this is why you see oftentimes natural pairs just devolve into homelessness. I've seen it over and over and over, right? So, why is the parent's presence so vital? Each parent function serves two vital roles for the ESTJ and INFJ. The first role is in interrupting and refining the hero-child loops. The second role is that the parent function fulfills is by putting the appropriate amount of pressure on the inferior function. The parent function is supposed to basically... It's like your parent function has become the guidance function for the other person's gateway function, the inferior function. That way, they're using their inferior function properly. So you, in the natural pair, end up becoming responsible for the other person's personal growth through guidance. But if your parent function is underdeveloped, or if you're lacking personal responsibility in your life, how the hell are you going to be able to guide them? That's the entire point. So looking at the perspective of introverted sensing parent pressure on the NI hero any child loop by interrupting the abstract looping of possibility by introducing concrete reality. Introverted sensing parent becomes the voice of practicality that speaks to both on its own. The child and the INFJ's NI hero has the perspective of, so we're going to make this happen or what? A responsible SI parent knows when to let the child and hero play and when to step in and be like, hey, let's stop playing and let's actually be responsible now. We have bills to pay. You know what I'm saying? Introverted sensing parent puts a gentle but appropriate amount of pressure on the extroverted sensing inferior to perform. Without the presence of introverted sensing parent, however, the INFJ has no one to perform for. If there is no pressure on the INFJ, they will stop growing. You know, this is why, whenever I'm in a relationship, for example, with a woman, I have extremely high standards, and I expect her to meet and exceed those standards. And if she doesn't, well, then I get another woman, or I start talking to another woman. That's just how it is. She has to meet that standard constantly. And it's not just a standard of extroverted sensing performance. I also expect her to, live by a high moral standard at the same time, of course. But more on that later when I talk about my own natural pair. Let's look at extroverted feeling parent. Extroverted feeling parent interrupts the introverted thinking TE loop in the ESTJ by filtering what is actually helpful. Extroverted feeling parent demands the occasional output to manifest while also providing their humane perspective. Sure, these ideas are great, but how do they help people? How do they help us? These are the types of questions that extroverted feeling parent ends up asking introverted feeling inferior. That way, introverted feeling inferior is just not wasting its time and being trivial, but it's actually improving the world. This is also what helps the ESTJ develop their INFP subconscious, and the INFP's responsibility is to bring more wisdom in the world. And the FE parent is to guide the ESTJ to get to that point, where the ESTJ can be like, hey, I can write a book about these principles and actually change people's lives for the better. Of course. It's like they're able to unlock their own internal Robert Greene as a result of the extroverted feeling parent INFJ partner that they have. That's literally how that works. So extroverted feeling parent also must take up the mantle of not only caring for the introverted feeling inferior, but challenging it by using the ESTJ's own values to demonstrate how rich or shallow their introverted feeling is. The FE parent must be willing to reveal the hypocrisy as well as the flim-flam or how flimsy the introverted feeling inferior is of the ESTJ. Or else the INFJ risks the corruption of the relationship. And this is how the INFJ can end up becoming corrupt as a result of being in the natural pair because of the high amount of enablement. Anyway, the point is, the parent's perspective is needed for this relationship to thrive and endure. The parent is the best antidote to enablement in the natural. So if you want to avoid the pitfalls of enablement, you guys need to make sure that you are pressuring each other properly towards personal growth. while personal growth was required to get in the relationship, it doesn't mean people arrived. It doesn't mean that. You have to make sure that personal growth is a consistent journey, not an outcome in the relationship. And that's what the parent function's responsibility is. Introverted sensing parent and extroverted feeling parent. So let's talk a little bit more about like how to get your natural pair, right? So natural pairs are often the longest lasting relationships people have. They're also the most challenging to get into. And why are they so hard to get into? So this is a little bit of review. The core expectation that must be met for a natural pair to become intimate is as follows. They will be successful in their life regardless of if I had ever met them or not. And I talked about this earlier. Like, there has to be some amount of introverted or of inferior function development or aspiration over time. How is this expectation measured? It is measured primarily through inferior function development or aspiration, or evidence of the path to inferior development. But who is measuring the inferior's development? It is part of each other's parent function, who is attuned to the other's inferior. However, primarily, guys, it's actually the critic function. The critic function is what people utilize to assess other people for the natural pair. So the critic must see that the other's inferior is at least on par with their own. Okay, so this is where it gets super risky when you're assessing people to be in a relationship with for your natural pair. So, like, you have extroverted sensing critic of the ESTJ. An ESTJ, if the ESTJ knows that they can outperform an INFJ, like, for example, an ESTJ woman who's like a very capable athlete, they meet an INFJ, but that INFJ man is not more athletic than they are, the ESTJ woman cannot be attracted to that man. It just doesn't happen. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen at all. Like, that guy has no chance with her, like, at all. No chance with that woman. Conversely, you know, the INFJ's FI critic, it's like, if they believe that they have far better moral principles and a better sense of self-worth, and if they actually believe that they are a better person than the ESTJ, that INFJ is not going to be attracted to the ESTJ whatsoever. Because the INFJ is like, you have FI inferior, that introverted feeling function is in your ego. You should be a lot more human and a lot better at being a human than I am. And if you're not, I can't be attracted to you. The people who are assessing each other for their natural pair, it's all done at the level of the critic. And once they pass the critic test, great, they can be in a relationship. The problem is it's still a critic. And people oftentimes rely on the critic where it's like, okay, do they need to have any more personal growth? Well, no, because they're already better at it than I am. What business do I have providing additional challenge? That's where personal responsibility comes into play. That's where parent functions come into play. So they should stop relying on their critic to assess the other person. They have to start relying on their parent functions to assess the other person later in the relationship. Because at the beginning of the relationship, it's all about wants, right? And after the honeymoon period phase of the relationship, it's all about needs. That's when it shifts from critic function assessment during honeymoon period and then to parent function assessment post honeymoon period. That's the whole point, folks. That's how it works. So, again, the critic must see that the other's inferior is at least on par with their own, but oftentimes it's more. It's more than just being on par. The critic function is just really how it is. So let's look at extroverted sensing critic, the ESTJ. It must respect the INFJ's SE inferior for the relationship to work. If the extroverted sensing critic does not see the INFJ putting in the effort to their performance or performing well or having the ability to perform at all, SE critic will not respect the INFJ and no attraction can actually take place. Okay? But then likewise, the introverted feeling critic of the INFJ must see the ESTJ's FI inferior committing to acting out their morals and demonstrating their capacity for gratitude and investment. It also must see the ESTJ having a modicum of self-respect. If the FI critic smells too much selfishness, entitlement, and hypocrisy within the FI inferior, the INFJ will not respect the ESTJ, much less even be attracted to them. That's a huge problem. To the critic, inferior development is proof of concept for this relationship to even take place. It's also proof of concept for attraction. The critic demands some level of competence from the other person's inferior function. But why are the critic and the parent so involved in this test? Passing the critic's test gets you into the relationship, while passing the parent function's test keeps you in the relationship. When a relationship gets past the honeymoon phase, for example, like what we just talked about, what does the parent function want? The parent wants humility from the inferior. Humility demonstrates that the inferior will listen to the parent and follow its guidance. Remember, folks, inferior functions are still gateway functions. And it can be very prideful, very arrogant for a person who lacks personal responsibility to rely on their own parent function as a guidance function for their own inferior function. Usually most people don't have that, and the natural pair exposes that. And when the natural pair, when you can actually humble yourself to allow the other person's, your partner's parent function to become your guidance function for your inferior function, all of a sudden you're not transitioning into the other sides of your mind, especially subconscious, in a chaotic way, but you're doing it in a more orderly manner. And then as a result of it being more orderly, you're having a lot more success in your life. I mean, just try it out, folks. That's how it works. And that's ultimately why the natural pair is successful in the long term. They're literally outsourcing guidance functions to their partner. Spend time listening. Humble yourselves. Do that instead. Okay? There's value there. All right? So that's why humility is ultimately important. So let's talk a little bit about, some of the gender differences, though. So don't forget, when it comes to, while we've talked about the 16 types, these are nature on paper, but the female perspective and the male perspective changes different things. So a female INFJ, they're selfish. They're entitled because they're solipsistic, because they're built to consume more so than produce. Whereas the masculine INFJ is built more to produce than to consume, basically. Okay? It's a different approach. Also, masculine idealism causes, men to ultimately take on the romantic role, be the lover, etc. They ultimately end up becoming more self-sacrificing as a result due to their masculine idealism. The problem is that if a man gives into his masculine idealism too much within the context of an ESTJ INFJ relationship, it ends up inhibiting that parent function from stopping the enablement to stopping the cognitive looping. Because it's okay, well, why bother? Why even be involved at that point? It ends up becoming a huge problem. Masculine idealism is the thing. So the masculine idealism, while it is important, they cannot use their masculine idealism to surrender their personal responsibility as well as their own burden of performance. This goes for both the ESTJ and the INFJ. The burden of performance meaning the burden of responsibility within that context. I'm not talking performance terms, SE performance. I'm talking it is their responsibility to maintain their parent function. Parent function is absolutely a requirement and entirely necessary. So that's one thing. The other thing is that solipsism, on the part of women, female ESTJs and female INFJs, that solipsism can also cause them to lack personal responsibility. Remember, masculine idealism exists so that we have the rite of passage for men, so that men end up realizing that society and even sometimes their women are going to sell them out. So they have to put themselves first. That's the point. That's how they're able to control their masculine idealism, and then as a result of that, further develop their parent functions. With women, however, it's the exact opposite. While they may be solipsistic and more prone to being far more selfish than the men in their lives, they need to get to a point where they can humble themselves and ultimately submit within the context of a relationship and actually be willing to put their ESTJ or their INFJ partner above themselves. Even put their own children above themselves. They need to, I remember this INTJ woman telling me, I am third. Yeah, you are third. You are a third-class citizen within your relationship. Your man comes first, and if you have children, then your children, then you. That's why you're the first one to get up in the morning and the last one to go to bed. That's how a woman deals with solipsism. That's how she can utilize her feminine nature to develop her parent function for the sake of keeping her natural pair together indefinitely. It's super important. Without these things, cognitive looping gets worse. So cognitive looping makes men more idealistic, but it also makes women more solipsistic. That's why you have to develop the parent. Learn the lessons of the rite of passage. Women's rite of passage is getting pregnant and having a baby. Their life is on the line. As much as a male rite of passage is, you have no value. You have no value when you're born. You have to build value. You have the burden of performance as a male. You can't get away from that. You have to generate value. You have to never stop generating value. But the natural pair puts men at the risk of enabling them such that they stop generating that value. Honestly, there's actually a very good chance that Adam and Eve was a natural pair. I really think so. There's a huge chance of that. I think it's very likely. I almost to the point where I could assume that's the case. So, how do the genders view each other within the context of this pair? So, women view men like a business. The INFJ or ESTJ man must carry his burden of performance. He needs to be generating value. He needs to be generative. King, warrior, magician, lover. King is producing more than you consume. Warrior is defend your family, defend your business, defend your honor, defend everything, and be capable of defending it towards any threat, even a threat from within. Okay? Magician is going out of your way to reach out to your fellow men and help them achieve king and warrior in the same manner that you have. And lover is be willing to enjoy life even for yourself and enjoy life on your own up to that point. Like, go take yourself on a date. I mean, I took myself out on a date recently. I went to P.F. Chang's and had dinner at P.F. Chang's and talked to the bartender and had an interesting debate about masculinity and femininity to some Californians that I met at the bar. In which case they told me I was out of my mind. But, most people think I'm out of my mind anyway, so, I mean, it is what it is, right? So, like, that's the thing. Men view women as art. The INFJ or ESTJ woman must carry her burden of submission and ultimately preservation of her beauty. Like, that's a big deal. A woman who's incapable of submitting is not a beautiful woman. She's an ugly woman. And as much as, people can't accept that's a fact. And it goes especially double for the natural pair. Because she's most likely to be submissive within the context of natural pair, but if she's not, then the parent function becomes underdeveloped and the enabling gets really bad, and then the relationship could cause these two people involved, because the relationship's not likely to end. It would just cause them to be set back, and they end up becoming toxic to each other and everyone else, but they're so ignorant because of that toxicity. They're so ignorant of the toxicity that they end up becoming a burden on each other and others, and yet they think it's normal, and it inhibits their growth, which is horrible. Let's talk about, the temples. So, origins. Origins is ultimately what people want more than anything. There's a concept within the natural pair, from an origin point of view, and that concept is basically like, hey, like, for example, my primary origin is satisfaction. I want satisfaction out of life, but my secondary origin is reverence, right? Well, the primary origin for the ESTJ is power and authority, but their secondary origin is validation, right? And then the primary origin for the INFJ is intimacy and connectedness versus their secondary origin, which is justification. The thing is, though, is that if an ESTJ is providing that power and authority and gaining additional power and authority and exercising their power and authority within the context of their relationship in the natural pair, they will actually empower the INFJ. And that level of empowerment where they're sharing their power and authority with their partner, guess what? It helps elevate the position and power and authority of the INFJ within the context of the relationship. When that happens, guess what? The INFJ ends up having all of the justification they would ever want, because they've already been elevated to a position of power and authority by the ESTJ. That's literally how that works. Isn't that amazing? So they realize, like, oh, yeah, I really want justification, but power and authority is much better. Yeah, it is. Same thing goes from the ESTJ perspective. They want that, the INFJ is providing intimacy and connectedness, but the ESTJ is looking for validation. But then they realize that intimacy and connectedness provides a lot more validation than they ever imagined. And they realize that their desire for validation, that shadow desire for validation, is actually really shallow compared to the intimacy and connectedness that the INFJ is bringing to the relationship. And it's like, oh my God, this is better. This is even better than the golden pair. Because the golden pair, it's just a direct exchange of their origins. But because they're bringing in different origins into the relationship, like, they're getting something that they didn't even know they wanted. They're getting something better. It's kind of like when you're at the store and, you want to go buy yourself a Lego as a little kid. And then you're, like, looking at the Lego right in front of you. You're like, okay, Dad, I want this one. And Dad's like, nope, you don't want that one. You want this one. You let me pick. And Dad reaches up at the top shelf and gets you the big one. That's literally what the natural pair is all about from a cognitive origin perspective. That's literally what it's about. Isn't that amazing, folks? Isn't that just incredible? That's all it is. That's what it's for. Also, given the fact that the inferior function, which should be tested by the parent function, but if it is tested by the parent function, it's evidence that the origins are ultimately present. The reason why is because the INFJ and ESTJ subconscious exist in the same temple as their golden pair. So the ESTP subconscious exists in the mind temple, and the INFP subconscious exists in the soul temple. So the vital insight of cognitive origins gives us this. As insulating and ego-protecting as the natural pair can be, there's also still a path for mutual growth and development for each ESTJ or INFJ's psyches if it's done correct. The bottom line is, folks, that while the critic assesses, the SE critic or the FI critic assesses the inferior function of the other person to the natural pair for the ESTJ and the INFJ. The bottom line is that developing the parent, going through the same personal growth track that each person went through to aspire with their inferior function, which is what allowed them to get into the relationship to begin with, they have to do the same thing during the relationship, but with developing their parent function. And then as a result of that key thing, as a result of that ultimately is what basically compounds. It's like a compounding interest. It compounds the relationship and makes it better and better and better and better and worth the investment from both people. That right there, folks, is why this relationship is the most likely for people to get married. It's also the most likely relationship to last out of all of the relationships out there, and ultimately, arguably, why socionics and many other people maintain that the natural pair is actually the best out of the 8 sexually compatible relationships, to the point that it may even be better than the golden pair. Awesome. Anyway, folks, thanks for watching and listening. I hope you enjoyed this extra long lecture, but episode 1 is a little bit longer because of the introduction. And I will see you guys on the next episode, which will be the ESTP and the INFP.